Chapter 4 in your text takes a closer look at the empirical record related to intersectionality and difference when it comes to gender representation. As your book identifies, intersectionality was originally a way of understanding Black women's experiences, and the phrase was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw and works that she wrote in the early 1990s. And she was very critical of the tendency to compartmentalize into separate boxes people's identity. So she believed that the same systems that perpetuated racial inequalities were the same ones that perpetuated gender inequalities, and that they were interlinked and reinforced one another. And she was not the first to identify this pattern in gender and race relations. She's just the first to do some systematic research and give it this terminology. And then under third wave feminism, there began to be a new line of thought about including ethnicity, religion, nation, indigeneity, sexuality, disability, age, and more as part of understanding these overlapping elements of our identities. And this has led to greater findings in the field of research, but from some activists and scholars' point of view, it has had the impact of decentering Blackness from these theoretical approaches. And that, for some, especially Black feminists, is problematic since they're already dealing with a pattern of erasure of their experiences. So some view this in a similar way. So there are a lot of different ways that you can look at intersectionality, whether that is just from a Black feminist perspective or one that includes these other layers of marginalization like disability and language and religion and even sexuality. So there are arguments about that, and even arguments about the proper way to conceptualize the way that these different identities link together. But there are 5 basic things about which they agree. The first is that there are differences among women that make their experiences worth scientifically and systematically and also just anecdotally recognizing. And they also recognize that the institutions of our society that stratify people are locked together. So race and gender, race and racism mutually reinforce one another and rely on one another. So these systems that create hierarchies depend on each other. There's an explicit reference to power relations in society and intersectionality, and it is very important to recognize that because women's position, and especially minority women's position to the power sources, is a constant reference point. And a fourth common element is that they recognize the complexity of these overlapping identities. And then finally, there is a goal of social justice, not just to recognize analytically how these different experiences impact representation and what we think about politics, but also with an eye to correcting social injustices. Intersectionality draws our attention to the fact that different marginalized identities come with different barriers. And when we have more than one type of marginalization, we may face more than one barrier when it comes to political participation or representation, equality, and other concepts that we find important to politics. So we recognize that there are barriers to political participation that coincide with gender, like queerness, indigeneity, or statelessness. And as a result, we try to understand through the lens of intersectionality how gender and minority status together influence minority women's experiences. And the wisdom that we get from this is that women from marginalized groups occupy distinct positions in society, and this gives them specific value and worth to the operation of the system, but they have less opportunity to participate than women from privileged backgrounds. And in terms of their levels of representation, they have achieved it a lot slower than majority women. And this is true not just in the Americas, where white women's representation is higher than that of Black women. This is also true of other minorities around the world. This bar graph more or less illustrates the previous point about the overrepresentation of majority races or sexualities or religions compared to the minorities. And you see that minorities are very underrepresented compared to their slice of the population, especially minority women whose composition of the legislature comes nowhere close to making up the composition of the population. To put it in other terms, majority ethnicity men are 9 times more likely than minority women to get elected to national legislature. When it comes to sexuality, 80% of LGBT politicians are gay men, and that can be even more exaggerated in certain regions. For example, in Latin America, only 1 woman politician among the LGBT politicians is present. In addition, we look at indigenous women as another identifiable but also very diverse group within who we consider indigenous. Around the world, people who were occupying a land first prior to colonization oftentimes are among the most vulnerable, and the women among them are also extremely vulnerable. The picture I have here, you may be familiar with the red hand across the mouth. Indigenous women in Canada and the United States are using this to raise awareness of the extreme number of Indigenous women who go missing every year and the amount of women who are murdered on Indigenous reservations. And usually the perpetrator goes unpunished. Indigenous women have a long tradition, an ancient one even, of holding leadership roles in their communities. And this changed because of settler societies and colonial authorities who would only negotiate with Indigenous men. And this inequality has persisted until today. Only in New Zealand and Ecuador do you find Indigenous women represented proportionally to their population. That being said, more and more countries are electing Indigenous women. So they also look at transgender women and gender non-conforming women, as well as intersex people, as a type of intersectional identity. And while we don't really agree on what constitutes transgender, but we generally do agree that in some way or another, transgender people do not identify with or present as the sex that they were assigned at birth. This identity may or may not align with medical steps, and transgender people also may or may not identify as non-binary or genderqueer or gender non-conforming. Sometimes transgender people also identify with the indigenous terms for gender non-conforming people. Examples of this are the Native American Two-Spirit, the Indian Kinar, or the Mexican Mixte. Intersex people are people whose biological conditions do not result in a clear binary sex category. And they also are a marginalized population and fit within the LGBTQ population. The first transgender population was elected to New Zealand in 1999. This person was also a Maori indigenous person. The first openly intersex politician was not elected until 2011. In 2015, the number of transgender officials across the globe was 20, and that's at all levels of government. And this has been a slow progress as transgender people face severe discrimination. They are the number one victims, especially transgender women of color, are the number one victims of hate crimes, and they also have little legal protections in most systems. And another important thing to point out is that most transgender people who do win office are usually white people. Sometimes strategic opportunities come with being a woman and also a member of another marginalized group. And this is what some scholars have called the puzzle of success, where women actually somehow outperform the majority women's group if they're from a minority group. For example, Latino women legislators in California are often able to leverage their intersectional identities to prove themselves as effective advocates for working communities of color. In addition, women from racial and ethnic minority groups tend to occupy a greater share of their group's legislative seats than do women from majority groups. And so women of color have been outperforming white women since the 1970s. For example, in 2010, women of color held 35% of seats held by their racial ethnic group compared to 23% held by white women. It is not parity, but it is a better performance. And this is not universal. This overperformance, if you want to call it that, is more common in sub-Saharan Africa and the West. So sometimes minority women carry a greater share of their ethnicity or linguistic group or racial group's proportion in government that compared to the majority women's share, because minority women can be seen as non-threatening to other minority groups. As one scholar, Bird, comments, they tend to carry, or are thought to carry, less of the cumbersome cultural baggage of their ethnic community. They're often viewed as more moderate with better interpersonal skills and as better able to negotiate between the mainstream and minority cultures. Another element of this puzzle has been called complementary advantage, and this is where young ethnic minority women are chosen to help balance out white male tickets of a party that is skewing white and male. Another element of this puzzle relates to trans women. We mentioned that trans women are usually white when they win office, but trans women actually outperform trans men. Only 6% of transgender candidates between 1977 and 2015 were trans men. There are additional challenges for women who are from some type of minority when it comes to achieving basic civil rights and also with representation. Women from marginalized groups are often situated within at least two subordinated groups, and these two groups sometimes pursue agendas that conflict with one another, which leaves minority women with a strange and hard choice. Minorities in general have been faced with the pressure to assimilate through most of modern history. And beginning in the 1990s, a new type of integration of minorities began to be sought, which was less an erasure of the way that different cultures live and more of an acceptance of the diversity. And in feminist terms, some have argued, especially Mahler Oken, that multiculturalism sometimes tries to protect cultures and traditions that promote men's control over women. And she argues that minority groups are often concerned with personal or family laws like divorce, child custody, marriage, division of property, and inheritance. And some traditions that, like these, tend to disadvantage women. These authors speak of quote, special rights for marginalized groups. And they argue that the seeking of special rights for such groups can create division and loyalty for the women. The example that they use is Muslim women in Western countries today having to face issues around security and their headscarves. They're seen as seeking, quote, special rights. Incidentally, I do want to remark, I'm a little surprised at this language that they're using because special rights tends to be a negative thing, a negative label that's attached to LGBT rights and even some women's rights. So I was a little surprised to see the authors using this language because I feel it's a little bit loaded. In any event, sometimes these special rights or multicultural rights are those that allow for indigenous jurisdiction over things like marriage and family and tribal councils making local decisions and things like that. But it's worth noting that some cultural rights are actually good for women's equality. For example, the practice of Chachawarmi, which is an Aymara principle from South America. And this is the principle that both men and women contribute equally to the good of society. So both are equal, even though they may contribute different values or different skills. So this principle among some Andean ethnic groups actually has contributed to women's representation in social movements and in local government. Women from marginalized groups are often made invisible in a public discourse about inequality. Women often means white or the majority, and minority often means men. What this means is that minority women are expected to be represented by the majority of their gender, and their gender is supposed to be represented by men of their race. And so essentially this is something that early intersectional scholars have noted, and there are consequences to this type of invisibility. For example, in post-apartheid South Africa, there was a focus on racial equality among judgeships, but no one seemed to notice that only 15 of the Superior Court judges were women who were Black compared to their 41% of the population. And often the public discourse pits women against marginalized groups, much like you saw with the suffrage movement in the United States, as though there's a choice between women's rights and minority rights. And this often ignores women's diversity and the fact that they have different stakes, and they may have stakes in both communities fighting. And some have argued that those in power actually gain from pitting minorities against each other because it helps them maintain political order, and only so much gets challenged if the people are fighting for smaller pieces of the pie, so to speak. In more conspiratorial language, if you keep minority groups pitted against one another, they never tend to turn on the majority power, who is usually responsible for the systemic oppression or inequality. So another consequence of invisibility and erasure is that it could lead to crises of descriptive and substantive representation. Without descriptive representation or enough women of a certain description, minority women may not have the numbers that they need to advance the needs of women in their group. And institutional and contextual barriers prevent women from standing for distinct political interests of their group. They are expected to embrace the entrenched agendas of their party, and they also face conflicting expectations from their ethnic group, from women, from the institutions that they serve in, and also within their political parties. So it is very difficult for them to live up to all of the demands that are made of minority women. And they often become the focus of intense political debate that pulls them in multiple directions, or they end up not having their voices heard at all. Because minorities are easily discredited in the mainstream, the availability of symbolic representation may be low. You may not see yourself represented in your legislature or in your positions of leadership. And there are some issues with being visible in these positions. So some politicians have had to and are able to pass. This is sometimes the case for the LGBT community, but it's also true for example, ethnic and linguistic minorities in Turkey who must kind of shield their more controversial alliances, as is the case with the Kurds, who are vastly unpopular. Indigenous people, depending on where they are, may be able to hide their identity if they dress like the mainstream or speak the mainstream language. Some people with disabilities also are able to hide their disability and choose whether or not to make that public knowledge. But coming out about all of those things sometimes can do what the previous slide talked about, make you the subject of an intense political debate based on your identities. And sometimes that's discrediting as well. And another big issue with symbolic representation is even when someone of your ethnic group and gender is elected, are they able to really represent the marginalized? And this is actually an example that played out with the two Mapuche representatives from Chile. The first two women were elected in 2017, Emilia Nullado and Araceli Lequin, and Araceli Lequin was from an urban center. She had been raised very privileged, whereas Emilia was raised rural, like traditional Mapuche. And the Mapuche are like the poorest people in Chile, so they're heavily marginalized. And there was no doubt that Emilia was seen as really being the more representative, and some people really rejected Araceli because she was not seen as being indigenous enough. So the challenges are great when it comes to being a woman, but if you are a minority woman around the world, the challenges are doubled or tripled. And that's basically the point of intersectionality. And so the most important thing we can do is hold this complexity in our mind as we look at any situation analytically that involves women. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great week.